Hello YouTube, hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to look at what I consider to be the 10 most important works that were ever written in fantasy during the history of the entire genre. I've mentioned before I have a big love of the fantasy genre. I've read stuff as old as some of the first fantasy stuff that was ever written, all the way up to modern stuff that's been written in the last 2 or 3 years. I still have a big passion for the genre. This is the first genre I really embraced, loved. Went out from reading game books that were being written, from Lone Wolf and The Dragon's Den and Choose Your Own Adventure, all the way to children's books and modern stuff. I've also continued to keep current with fantasy stuff as it's being published for stuff that other people that are younger than me are reading too. So for example, I've read all of Harry Potter, even though at 42 I'm too old to have Harry Potter be published when I was a kid and such. So I've tried to keep current with a number of different sort of fantasy works, because my passion for the genre is so much. And if you were to look here up on my shelf, you're going to see more fantasy stuff than any other genre. Although I've read more horror in the last 20 years probably than science fiction or fantasy, because of my huge love for the genre growing up and how much I pretty much read fantasy pretty much exclusively growing up. And I used to devour books in a much more quicker clip. I could read a book every other day or so. So, I mean, because of that, overall, I've read a whole lot more fantasy than I had the other genres. I also, for that reason, I feel more confident in making this video, talking about some of the best of all time, and looking at those and so forth. So today, again, I'm going to be looking at what I consider to be the top 10 fantasy videos of all. Fantasy works. I just totally screwed that up, of all time. So let's take a look at those top 10 fantasy works. Now, for me to be a fantasy work, it needs to be something more than just a book. So what I'm looking for are things that have been around, that have really sort of inspired people. I'm not going to choose things for my top 10 works of all time that are just totally, you know, an Abe's thing coming from off the shelf. They're not going to be something that hasn't been influential, that hasn't stood the test of time, that hasn't been a very, very good sort of a series or a set of books. Fantasy as a genre is something where a lot of its best stories are told over multiple different sort of settings. You have trilogies, multiple book sets, short story series that will go on for 50 or more short stories, novellas, different worlds that are made with these different sorts of elements to them. So in fantasy, I find that many of the best stories are ones that are big, giant, epic ones that are told over multiple books and multiple stories. And so you're going to be seeing some of that today with me telling you what my favorite works are. Now, this is not a list of my top 10 favorite fantasy authors. I have fantasy authors that I love that are nowhere near this list. They don't have a work that's seminal. For example, Clark Ashton Smith would definitely be one of my top 10 favorite writers. He'd be in the back 5, but he'd be one of my top 10 favorite fantasy writers. He's not here. But Clark Ashton Smith, on the other hand, is doesn't have a work out there, and my favorite works of his aren't any different or any more innovative than his other works that he has out there. So there's not, you know, 1 or 2 series out there that are kind of a definitive world that he wrote, like Zophic Cycle or something, or Hyperborea stories or something like that. But so I love him and his writing, and I would consider him a great writer. But he doesn't have this definitive work, this definitive series that you can really kind of hang his hat on and say, Clark Ashton Smith, that's where he is. So again, for me, it has to be a major work. It was influential, it stood the test of time, and such. In fact, 8 of these series are going to be ones that started before I was born. Sometimes they wrote stories in them afterwards. I was born in 76. I'm 42. So again, some of these are going to be, you know, older, but all of these stories, except for a couple of them, the first 2 actually, are going to be ones. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, before I start with my top 10, I do want to let you know that I do consider my first 3, 10, 8, and 9, to kind of be relatively on the same playing field. When I was sitting down trying to create this list and the order of the list, the top 7 to me were very, very obvious that they were the top 7. And I think that their order can be argued, but I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of conversation as to what those top 7 are, to my mind. I do think, though, that the next 3, I think that there's probably going to be at least another 10 different works that I think are just as really compelling as these. I think there's a real plateau for the top 7, and then after those, you can just choose whatever you want to for a lot of these. I chose ones that I think personally are the next 3, but you know, I think that there's a lot of other ones out there that you could definitely look at, and I think are definitely interchangeable with the ones. So let's go ahead and take a look. My number 10 choice is going to be the current series, George R.R. Martin's The Song of Ice and Fire. Now, his series, first of all, George R.R. Martin is very interesting as a writer. He actually started decades and decades ago. He was cutting his teeth writing a variety of different genres, winning awards. He was winning awards in the 70s for like Nebulas and Hugo Awards and stuff like that. So he already kind of cut his teeth on that. One of the things that his series does, which is definitely very influential for stuff, most things that have been written since he started writing his first books have definitely had this sort of a political, kind of a low fantasy feel to him, more of a realistic, grounded feel to him. He's number 10 because he's not my best wordsmith. I think at times he can get a little. He's not the best writer for his work of these. So he's not my number 10 writer. But I do think that he's not higher than this. But I do think that his works are good. He cut his teeth. He's definitely somebody who's been around the block and has done a lot of good stuff. And it is very, very resonant. So my number 10 is going to go to. Now, my number 9 work is going to be Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. There's my third copy of the book by him. The Wheel of Time series started coming out in the 90s. The first book of that, it's actually pretty small and easy to read. It actually has a very succinct closing to it, although the world stays open. But then his books will continue. He'll continue to write a lot of them. And they're going to be very, very long and very, very intricate. And he's going to get really kind of delving into the world. And he kind of builds up this pace. And he does a great job with it. And a lot of people just love it. And to my mind, he's one of the most important epic fantasy writers in this sort of traditional heroic tradition of this giant world-spanning conflict that between good and evil. This sort of Tolkienian style of writing is one that he definitely has pushed into fruition. He's one that he's very strong with and very resonant with. His world is pretty good. Coming out from it, whether you're talking about a pacifist or Gleeman and such, there's a lot of good stuff to go with the world itself. Now, one of the things that puts him at 9 is that he can sometimes get a little too over-ambitious and overzealous. If he comes across a scene that he likes, he's going to spend a lot of pages on that scene. And that's the reason I think the series drug on as long as it did. And while the books kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger in length. Robert Jordan's a good writer, though, and a lot of people really loved his stuff. I actually put down, to be honest with you, the series after book 7. I felt that it was he'd gotten to the point where I was just reading too many pages in it. But from the first 6 books, man, that stuff was good. I thought it was really good. And I'm putting him at my number 9 spot on my best series of all time. Now, my number 8 on this list, and this is going to be my highest ones of the one, like if you're from the last one before you get the next level, the next plateau, because I think there's a big jump up in quality from 8 to 7. My next list is going to be the Earthsea series by Ursula K Le Guin. Ursula K Le Guin is definitely a very good writer. She has a lot of great stories, and really where she's really strong are her ideas, which is important for the genre she's writing in. Many of her science fiction works are incredibly good, and we're actually going to be looking at some of them later on as a part of this overall review series. She's just an incredibly talented writer when it comes to having these great ideas. And the Earthsea series is no different. In fact, the Earthsea series is the only children's series that's going to be on my top 10 list. I thought about including some others here in this bottom 3 of this top 10. That aren't a part of the top 7. And I thought, for example, about J.K. Rowling and her Harry Potter works, which are really good, among others. But ultimately, I didn't feel that she had enough of the standing test of time and the sort of durability and such that I think that some of these other writers have had. Ursula K Le Guin wrote her series over a long time. The first one is very, very good. It's very, very, her world is very, very interesting with all the different things that are going on and the true name concept and such. And so it's definitely a really good world. I enjoy it a lot. It definitely is something that I will go back to as an adult and read again. There's only an initial trilogy, and then she does another book, Tejano, afterwards. Kind of sums up some of the stuff that had happened in the first 3 books. So it's very fast if you were interested in picking it up and you've never seen it. I recommend it. It's pretty good. But that's Ursula K Le Guin's Ursi, and I'm putting that at my number 8 spot. Okay, now my next, like I said, my next level of production kind of increases, and we're going to go to my number 7 spot. So my number 7 spot's going to be going to Robert E. Howard, and specifically to his works that look at his Conan the Barbarian stuff. Now, most of the stuff that he wrote is going to be in the pulp era. It's going to be written in the 20s, 30s, and 40s for major pulp magazines. It's going to be in an era where there's a lot of other pulp stuff out there. His stuff is real, the Conan stuff is very, very good at getting across this sort of idea of a noble savage against the sort of bad guys of his time, which are decadent civilizations. So it's definitely sort of this idea of nobility versus decadence when it comes to his central conflicts. But one of the things Robert Howard is incredibly good at, incredibly gifted with, is his ability to really sort of give you a real palpable sense of what's going on. For example, in my favorite story that Robert Howard wrote in Conan, Beyond the Black River, there is, at the end of it, there's this creature that happens to be this unnatural, just creature whose very existence is just wrong. And he has this incredibly good way of writing about it. Now, if you know the history, it's just a saber-toothed tiger. I mean, a saber-toothed tiger in fantasy worlds and fantasy speak is just a saber-toothed tiger. I mean, it's not even a big concept to have in a fantasy work. But he writes it so well and so just strongly that I was just taken aback by it, by how well he wrote it and how well he wrote it as this menace for Conan to have to deal with. And that's who Robert is. Once he gets an idea, he's going to write it. He relishes it, and such. He was nicknamed Two Gun Bob by H.P. Lovecraft, and so that's what I'm going to call him because I think that's a great nickname. Two Gun Bob is probably the worst of the 7 writers for the next set of series. That's why I'm putting him back here at 7. His work is incredibly influential. Tons of people followed up Conan stuff with similar sorts of barbarians and similar types of stories that came along. The character is still popular with comics and movies, video games, and lots of other places in media too. All the stories that were written in Conan are short stories, so you can, if you wanted to, pick up the 3 or 4 collections that are out there, and then you can read a short story a day or something like that, or just keep it in your bathroom as your bathroom read and such. So there's a lot of great ways that you can still kind of interact with the Conan world that I think helps to show how resonant and well done Howard was at creating this world, as well as the character of Conan and how resonant Conan is. Okay, now it's time for my number 6 work. And this will be my last work that's not going to be in a top 5 work. My number 6 work, and by the way, this is probably something I would put higher. I just love, I love the writer a lot more, but I think his series probably comes in at number 6, and that's The Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny. Roger Zelazny is a big award-winning guy. He gets kind of started in the 60s. The Chronicles of Amber, which is a heavy book, I'm going to put it down, is a series by him that's very, very, very good. I love it a lot. Now, Roger Zelazny is not ever going to write something that is similar to what other people are writing. He's just not going to do that. That's not who he is as a person. So when he comes to a genre, comes to a book, he's just going to come to it from a different sort of an angle of attack. For example, he wrote a science fiction story set in a colony, set in a far future of humans, and these humans have decided to take on sort of this Hindu pantheon and have created a world based on sort of the Hindu religion. So this colony has them taking on the aspects of the gods and so forth, of the founding people for the colony, and then all the people that have lived in since. It's called Lord of Light. It's almost like this mythic quality to it. It's an incredibly good story in the science fiction genre. And so that's what he'll do. He'll regularly tend to have these sort of mythic arcs He rarely come back to a story again, although and to a world again. He's just not who he is. Even his very first work, A Rose for Ecclesiastes, we're going to look at later. It's actually considered one of the best science fictional works of all time. So we're going to take a look at it later too. He is just an incredibly talented writer. We're going to look at tons of his stuff he's done. He's one of my top 10 favorite writers. But the Chronicles of Amber isn't going to be one of my top choices for this series, because while it is very influential, lots of people love it, it's a great thing, there's a lot of people who go back to it are kind of expecting this sort of fantasy tropes of people fighting all the time and stuff, and that's not happening here. It's more of a think piece. It's more of a political loggerman that's happening between these two folks. And what happens is you'll start off in Earth, set in a hospital where one of the folks is convalescing, and he realizes that what he actually is a member of from another plane of existence. He's a member of this fantasy family that rules pretty much all of existence, including the plane of Amber, and he can move around from plane to plane to plane. And their family has a lot of this sort of internecine fighting, and they're vying for control, and they have this sort of interchanging family alliances. And I definitely think that probably George R. Martin picked up on this and was influenced a lot by this sort of political infighting as sort of this major sort of concept. So there's not as many fights or brawls or anything like that coming. In fact, it's a lot more planning and plotting and conversations and backstabbing from families and such. It's a great, though, series. I love it to death. The first 5 stories were written as kind of a series. He'll go back to them and write them with the main character's son, who's a member of the Courts of Chaos rather than one of the Princesses of Amber. So he goes back and forth with that. But it's a great series. It's incredibly evocative of something very different that had never been written before. Heavily influential. Lots of video games and other stuff that would follow sort of this concept from. In fact, he was one of the major people to kind of push chaos as this major sort of theme in his works. He wasn't the first person to do so. We'll be looking at him later, actually, or the most popular person to do so. But again, he's this law versus chaos sort of dynamic. It's sort of the central conflict of him in his stories. So it's incredibly good, incredibly talented, and that will be the Lords of Amber by Zelazny, and that's going to be my 6th choice for the best fantasy work of all time. So now let's set aside the back 5 and look at the first 5, which is going to be number 5 through number 1. So number 5 is going to be Gods of Pagana and the rest of the series from the sort of this in the Pagana series and the dream cycle of stuff by sort of Edward Plunkett, Lord Dunsany. I've actually done this review for you already. By the time you'll have read this, it's an incredibly great story. And the Gods of Pagana and the sequel in particular are sort of like these mythological works that create this mythos in this made-up world called Pagana, where he will write some subsequent stories and a number of the sort of dream cycle stories that will occur. It's incredibly good. It's incredibly influential. There are tons of people that are out there that are going to write in a sort of Dunsanian style. Ursula K Le Guin, for example, will actually bemoan all the people out there who start writing in Lord Dunsany's sort of style. It's very different than anybody else you're going to read on this top 10, or anybody else for that matter. It's very much sort of a throwback mythic sort of style to it. It's very, very good. And he's an incredibly talented author, and his Gods of Pagana series in particular is one that was incredibly influential on everything that followed in fantasy, as well as a number of other genres too. But his fantasy in particular is the stuff that I really, really like. And so that's why he gets my number 5 spot. He's also just a strong writer on his own merits, which is also important to me too. There aren't as many stories in the Gods of Pagana, but that's okay because he's such a strong writer. And then once you start reading Dunsany, you're going to want to read a lot of other stuff. At least I did. So I've read a lot of Dunsany stuff. He's really something that sticks with you, and he's just got a writing style that's just so different and outside the box, and you're going to remember it. And you're going to remember this work too, the Gods of Pagana, and its follow-up stuff too. All right, now we're also going to look at another series at number 4. I consider this person to be the best writer on my top 10 list. He's only hit at number 4 because his work, while it's very influential, is very little. And this is the person on this list I wish would have written a lot more stuff. And this is Jack Vance's The Dying Earth series, style of magic from the Dying Earth series, and we'll invest it. So if you're familiar with Dungeons & Dragons magic style for fantasy and anything that came later on, you're going to be familiar with this. Lots of the magic concepts came from this too. They're named after famous wizards. So if you come across a spell that's named, Wizard's X spell or Wizard's magical artifact, like Abraham's purple hat as a magic artifact or something like that. There's everything that happens in it is unique. A lot of the things that he creates, like the Iron Stones and such, have really sort of resonated in fantasy. He's a hugely important writer for the genre. He also the Dying Earth series also gave the genre its name, the Dying Earth genre. And some people had written it previously, like the Zothic cycle by Clark Ashton Smith was actually a sort of end of the world magical era that we had. You're also going to have some things that are going to come later too. This sort of Dying Earth subgenre, that's one that he is going to sort of name and popularize and really kind of put on the map in a major way. He's a great writer. Jack Vance is an incredibly talented writer, and I wish that he'd written just a whole lot more stuff in the Dying Earth series. It's just something that just never should have ended. It was just such a big hit. And speaking about another big hit that continued to go on, let's move on to my number 3. My number 3 is going to be Fritz Leiber. Fritz Leiber is probably the most awarded writer in fantasy, science fiction, and horror history. He won tons of Hugos. In fact, he wrote his first novel. It's actually the first of the Lankmar series in '39, and it's two-seek adventure. The core characters in this series are two thieves that are Grey Mouse, who's this tiny little guy who fights with a weapon in each hand, hugely dexterous, and then this large barbarian-ish type oaf named Fafford from the north, who fights with this big giant sword. They're very different people. They have different sets of skills. They have different sets of experiences and such. And they are best friends who work together in this giant city called Lankmar, which is arguably, I would argue that Lankmar is the single most important fantasy city, the most resonant city. It's this giant city that they'll play around with in the world that they're in. The city itself has been brought out in a lot of other places, including Dungeons & Dragons worlds that have been set there, and adventures modules that have been written there. The concept of the Thieves Guild, Thieves' Cant, the different abilities that thieves have, all comes from this series. So any sort of a fantasy concept of thieves comes from the Lankmar series. The thieves here, everything they're doing in this series is what they were doing in fantasy to come, and so it's hugely influential. Fritz Leiber, again, is a hugely talented person with tons of awards to his name, including tons of Hugos for novels, novellas, and short stories. Many of the stories in the Fritz Leiber Lankmar series, by the way, also won awards too. None of them are books, so he's got about 4 or 5 different collections of short stories that you can pick up that have all the different stories that were published from the late 30s all the way through the 70s. And they continue to get published all throughout his life. He would continue to go back and continue to flesh out the world and such. He continued to love it and was very much enamored of it all the way until his untimely death. So that's Fritz Leiber. He's incredibly influential. In fact, one of the things that makes Fritz Leiber really good is that he's also really sort of self-aware, and his stuff remains really funny. Some of his stories and characters that he'll put these two thieves into are just downright hysterical. It's hard to just read it without sort of, even after reading them 2 or 3 times, without sort of putting a smile on your face or laughing at the sort of things that are happening. Or one of them's getting drunk, or they're charmed, and so they're magical enemies with each other, or something like that. It's just a whole bunch of weird stuff happening. So it's an incredibly well done stuff. And I put Leiber up there in terms of his ideas and his award-winning styles with a lot of folks. So we'll take a look at some of his specific stories later that are in this, but he's my number 3 choice for the greatest work in fantasy history. Now, writer of all time, and I'm going to be choosing his Elric series. I definitely think that the Elric series is something that had something new to say. He started writing it in the 60s. In Elric he was specifically written as sort of an anti-Conan, or sort of an anti to the current big things that were happening in fantasy. The world itself is not one that's divided into good and evil, which was sort of the current dominant themes of the day, but into law and chaos, where gods of law and gods of chaos are sort of fighting against each other. Elric himself is a king of he's a tiny little guy who's a king of a race of evil people, kind of like dark elves, kind of proto dark elves, if you will, and these are evil people, and he is born sort of a vestige of a conscience. Now, he's not super good, if you're familiar with R.A. Salvatore, he's not super good like Dristo Erden. He's more neutral, like Zach Nafian would be. But he definitely doesn't like the evil folks that he has to associate with. Ultimately, he's going to disassociate himself with that. He's going to get this super powerful sword called Stormbringer, who I would argue is the most powerful and most best well-known fantasy weapon of all time, who sucks the souls out of the people that it cuts out to give him strength, which helps him because he's a weak little mage guy who's not very strong physically. So Stormbringer makes him physically strong and able to fight against people that he would otherwise not be able to fight against. Stormbringer is incredibly evocative as a sword and is one of the main characters of the storyline. It hungers for people. It'll want to kill his friends, his family, and such. Ultimately, he's going to leave his people, go adventure in the worlds of the humans, and ultimately he's actually going to, about 3 or 4 stories into the series, he's actually going to lead a human invasion of his kingdom and take out his own kind because they're evil. That is definitely different. I mean, it's just very, very evocative. He's definitely an important character. He's like this first major anti-hero in fantasy fiction. The writer, Michael Moorcock, is incredibly good, incredibly influential. One of the things he likes to do is he has got a lot of great ideas too. He's actually considered in Britain to be this great literary person who has transcended the genre of fantasy, science fiction, and such. As he's had a lot of great ideas. The one things that work for him is that he has this sort of multiverse where there are all these different planes, and all these different planes are sort of dealing with the war between law and chaos. And one of the sort of central people who's out there on all these sorts of planes fighting are these various aspects of this character called the Eternal Champion, who is condemned to eternally fight for causes and doomed to do so. And Elric is one incarnation of that type. There are other ones too, Hawkmoon, Corum, and stuff. So he has a lot of these number of planes, these different multiverses. He's actually the one who created the idea of a multiverse and all these different planes. Elric, though, is by far his best well-known work, incredibly influential, definitely has stood the test of time, this sort of anti-hero, who is this sort of born, this leader, this weak, a magical leader of this evil dark race, who he doesn't like and he despises, so he's going to turn against them and ultimately take him out. It's a very compelling sort of a mythic arc. And ultimately, he'll end up with his world being destroyed. It's very interesting. It's dark. It's a lot of anti-heroic stuff happening. And Stormbringer is just as good a character as Elric is, and just as influential as Elric is. And I definitely think that a lot of stuff that came later in fantasy is hugely influential and impacted by this series, such as dark elves, magic swords that can talk and that have their own character and will try to dominate you. I think that's probably where God got the intelligent weapons concept and stuff. So a lot of this stuff that you're reading about in modern sort of fantasy also comes from Moorcock, not just from all of his stuff, but specifically from the Elric Silvers. So that's my number 2. Now, my number 1, I really probably don't even need to say. I could probably just say, okay, there's my top 9. Everybody knows what number 1 is going to be. Have a good day. I can't have anybody here other than J.R.R. Tolkien, right? I'm putting both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings here as those sort of a trilogy plus the prequel to it. I don't think you can have anybody here other than Tolkien. That would just be weird. It wouldn't seem right not to end with Tolkien. He definitely has earned this right. Nobody has been more influential in fantasy genres than Tolkien. I mean, you just can't. There's just nobody that you can point to. Nothing that you can say about him that somebody else hasn't already said. He's incredibly interesting. His world is incredibly well defined. It's very different than any sort of fantasy story that come before. You are still reading fantasy stories today that are getting published today that are in that sort of a Tolkienian style of writing and world play and such, from the movies that were huge hits to his video games, board games. His son is still publishing his things. His notes Everybody cares about his stuff to this day. It's the best-selling stuff of all time. You can't not have him here as my finale, as my number one. You might think you're too cool for it. You're not. He deserves to be here. So there you are. They're my top 10 different fantasy works of all time. First, are some things that shouldn't have been on my list at all. Do you disagree with my number one choice? I'd love to hear what you think. Were there some people that you just had never heard of before? I think you should have. If you're a big fan of fantasy, I don't think any of these 10 people were outside of normal sort of fantasy conversations about hugely being influential. I think all 10 of these works are 10 of the most influential works in fantasy of all time. So I definitely think, if you haven't, you should. Check them out. You're going to love them. But again, was anything in here that surprised you? Anything in here you want to go check out? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Whatever you liked, what I hit and what I missed. Tell me in the comments below. I'd love to interact with you, engage with you, talk with you about what you thought about these works, what your own personal top 10 list of the greatest fantasy works would be, and so forth. I'd love to see that sort of stuff. So let me know. If you enjoyed this video, hey, I would really appreciate it if you took some time out of your day to subscribe. I mean, if you already watched it, you might as well go ahead and subscribe to the next one. This is the longest video we're going to have. Anything else is going to be a whole lot shorter than this. Most of the videos in this channel are going to be reviews of older works from the earlier parts of the horrors, fantasy, and science fiction genres. But we are going to have a few analyses like this video, as well as some other ones that are coming up. But again, it's mostly going to be reviews, hopefully give you a chance to see some hidden treasures or some things you may not have forgotten about or never heard of before, and get a chance to take a look at them and tell me what you think, if you have also had a chance to review them. So subscribe. There's going to be a lot more videos to follow up on this one. And hey, if you have watched this far, you know, I really want to thank you for taking some time out of your day to invest in me, my video, and this thing. Again, I appreciate it so much. We all have busy lives.